Good afternoon, and welcome to CSIS. My name is Scott Miller. I'm a senior advisor here at CSIS. I'd also, as well as the people in the room and the people who are probably still 5 minutes away by taxi, I'd like to also welcome the online audience. Today's event is being webcast streaming live at csis.org. That videocast and other materials will be available for viewing a few days after the event at csis.org. Just look for the event page and you'll find it. This event is being presented by the CSIS Freeman Chair in China Studies and the CSIS Scholl Chair in International Business, thanks to the support of the Heinrich Foundation. Today's subject is the economic rise of China and the specific role of foreign investment in that as a catalyst to that growth. We're delighted to be joined today by Michael Enright, who will discuss the contents of his new book, Developing China, the Remarkable Impact of Foreign Direct Investment. Professor Enright will be available for discussion after the event, and his book is available for sale in the lobby. You can't miss it. Before we turn over the program to Professor Enright and his presentation, it's my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Merle Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich has been engaged in international commerce since 1970, when he founded Global Sources, a business-to-business media company. In 1970, based on his appearance, he must have been about 15 years old, but we'll let that go. In any case, 40 years in the business is very impressive. He still serves as executive chairman of the firm that he founded, but he's also created the Heinrich Foundation, which sponsored Professor Enright's research. Please join me in welcoming Merle Heinrich.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all of you. We're delighted to be with you, and we want to sincerely thank President Hamre and Scott Miller and Scott Kennedy and the entire CSIS team for hosting us today and launching this book on FDI for China. The Heinrich Foundation's mission is to promote sustainable trade, and we try to do that in three different ways. One is through research, policy research, supporting trade-related education and training, and cultivating export-led job creation. We firmly believe that by advancing global trade, that we contribute to the economic development of participating countries, the innovation and industries, and certainly improving the standards of living amongst the customers of the day. The Heinrich Foundation's intent and the genesis of this book, Developing China, the Remarkable Impact of Foreign Direct Investment, was to better understand and explain the experience of China and the foreign invested enterprises that invested in China over the last 30 years. After considering several authors in May 2015, we commissioned Michael Enright and his team at Enright, Scott & Associates to carry out the research. And thanks to their research, for the first time, the full impact of FDI have been measured. And using this economic analysis, it is possible to identify with confidence that, for example, in 2013, invested FDI contributed some 33% to the gross national product and some 27% to its employment that year alone. I'd like to share with you what this book is about, and then I'd like to share with you what this book is not about. So first, let me start with what it is about, or at least our intent. This is a robust and outstanding study on how a single country planned and executed an FDI strategy that completely changed its economic trajectory, namely China. It is a study which details the pros and cons, the positives and the negative spillovers of FDI from a country perspective, as well as from a corporate investor's position and the community view. It details the implications and contribution made by the transfer of intellectual property, the importance of distribution channels, the development of supply chains, management training and support, and of course, the financial investment. When China embarked on its FDI program, it desperately needed to enable the modernization of its industries and provide employment for its people. The foreign investors knew that if they could build capacity in China, this would make them more competitive globally. The outcome is that China has become a major global economy, like we all know, and has elevated over 600 million people from poverty. And hundreds of foreign companies have become much more competitive through their investment in China. This research is equally applicable to the developed countries such as the US and Europe, looking to develop their infrastructure and prospective contributions to next-generation industries by attracting more FDI. It is the Heinrich Foundation's hope that other countries and other corporations will be able to maximize the benefits of foreign direct investment to further alleviate poverty, create stronger global economic partnerships, and to enhance sustainable global trade. Now, I'd like to tell you what the book is not about, and I trust that I don't disappoint any of you. The book is not about supporting any partisan political view, as expressed last evening. We're not there. This book is not about the impact of foreign direct investment on U.S. or European unemployment. And the book is not about the competitive advantage in the U.S. or European manufacturing. And the book is most certainly not about trade agreements, their appropriateness, issues of fairness, and regarding their implementation. Michael and I have our own opinions on these various topics, but this book is not about those things. We simply want to present the facts about FDI in China and the effect that FDI has had on China's economy. Host countries need to develop policies that create consistency for investors and sustainability for industries and communities. And we hope that through this book, we at the Heinrich Foundation would like to encourage investors and host countries to create mutually beneficial partnerships for leveraging the impact of FDI. And I'll hand over the microphone to Professor Michael Enright to present to you, Developing China, the remarkable impact of foreign investment. Michael.
Thank you. I would like to also express my thanks to CSIS, Scott and colleagues, and also to Mr. Heinrich and his colleagues at the Heinrich Foundation, without whom the work I'll report on would not have been possible. Well, in the discussions that we originally had back in 2015, one of the things that became obvious, because it's obvious globally, is that in a sense, globalization is under fire. When we look around the world these days, increasingly people are questioning the value of inward investment, the value of trade, etc. And what we see around the world is that foreign companies are coming under pressure, perhaps more pressure than they've been under in recent memory. And most studies, if we look at all the literature on foreign investment, and there's a lot of it, and there's a lot of work on foreign investment in China, it tends to sort of gravitate into two groups. One is the economic, the academic, econometric work, looking at directionality. Is foreign investment positively or negatively related to productivity, GDP growth, etc. And there's a lot of interesting work there, but again, it's directional rather than often getting a sense of magnitude. And it's subject to all the difficulties of unclear variables, imprecise interpretations, etc. And I can talk more about that later. The other literature is mostly sort of case-based. It's the experience of individual companies, individual countries, for better or worse. And what we find is that neither of these literatures by themselves or even collectively are particularly satisfying. because the result these days is that, in our view, few host governments have a complete picture of the impacts of foreign investment or even potential foreign investment on their countries, that few companies have the information, the firepower to make their case when it comes to suggesting greater openness for foreign investment. And as a result, basically, that the potential benefits for all parties are not necessarily realized. And so with this as a backdrop, again, started the project in 2015. It's been, 16, 18 months and counting. And we chose to focus on the impact of foreign investment on China's economy for a number of reasons, most of them obvious, right? China is the world's largest developing country. It's clearly a place where foreign investment has been important. It's one that has certainly been in the press recently in terms of the way foreign investment is being treated today. And increasingly, when we look at developing countries around the world, they're tending to look at China or to look to China as perhaps a model as to how they may deal with foreign investment. And what we did is we looked at foreign investment in China through several lenses, some of which I'll report more of or less of today. Obviously, we sort of pulled together all the facts and figures. We went through the historical policy analysis, and I'll describe that briefly. And the interesting thing there is that most people in the West don't understand that China's objective function in terms of allowing and or encouraging or attracting foreign investment is different. It's just different than the objective function when it comes to inward foreign investment in the US or UK or Germany or many other countries. We looked at the academic and think tank literature, as I mentioned before, and I'll describe that in a bit. We obviously compiled all the facts and figures at the national, regional, and local levels. But then we did something a little different. We applied the tools of economic impact analysis, the type of analysis that's frequently done for a new standalone investment. What's the likely economic impact of a new convention center? Or work that we've done, what's the economic impact of a third runway at the Hong Kong International Airport, or a bridge from Hong Kong across to Macau, to Zhuhai and Macau, Hong Kong, Macau, Zhuhai, or the creation or the licensing of casinos in Singapore, et cetera. And what we've done is we've figured out how to use some of these tools to look at foreign investment across an entire country. And to our knowledge, it's the first time that this has been done in quite this way. Then we also, in order to get a more granular look at what was going on, as we looked at a series of case studies of individual locations in China and exactly what foreign investment has meant to them over time, and also individual companies, or in one case a group of companies, to see how much impact even a single company can have on China's economy. So the idea was to use a multifaceted, multi-lens approach to home in on the same set of issues using several different tools, several different methodologies in order to get a more complete picture. Because, again, this is an important issue. It's an important issue in China because people don't know which way China is going to go when it comes to inward foreign investment. Foreign companies increasingly appear to be targeted or selectively targeted in terms of enforcement of the antitrust rules, anti-corruption rules, et cetera. You see very overt industrial policies trying to limit the activities of some foreign companies, or rather foreign companies in some sectors, and favoring local companies. It's also become fashionable almost in Chinese policy circles and academic circles to say, well, we really don't need that foreign investment. And to tell you the truth, we probably really didn't need that foreign investment in order to get to where we are today because, hey, we're China, right? We've grown dramatically. We've done a great job. And they have done a great job. But the fact that they've done a great job doesn't actually diminish the importance that the foreign enterprises have been, or have the importance in the economy that foreign enterprises are today in China. There's also a view that in some sense foreign companies stand in the way of Chinese companies, that if we can only sort of limit the behavior of the foreign companies, then maybe our indigenous companies will grow better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also some evidence on the other side. You know, if you look at the evolution, at least on paper, of the legal regime governing foreign investment, in particular the new draft foreign investment law, which may come into effect as early next year. It's a very interesting law, and it's a complete change in some ways from the prior legal regime covering foreign investment. Because instead of focusing on ex-ante approvals, it focuses in industries where foreign investment is allowed or encouraged, it focuses on ex-post reporting. And instead of trying to micromanage ahead of time, it's a move towards a much more administrative, regulatory, and legal governance approach for foreign investment, which is similar to what you would see in many countries around the world. Of course, the question always in China, as elsewhere, is how does it get enforced, right? So we see these two almost countervailing forces in play, and we don't know. And we don't know also what mix of pragmatism and ideology might govern the regime towards foreign investment in the future, because certainly in China today, in many areas, we're really not certain of how that trade-off is being made. Okay, again, let's dive into some of the details. One of the striking things in going back through the history of China's approach towards foreign investment is that it's a very distinct history. Of course, you know, in the modern world, foreign investment was introduced to China literally at the point of a gun. And for roughly a century, foreign investment in China did mean economic modernization, but it also meant extraterritoriality. It meant, Chinese excluded, right, from enclaves within the country. And so it was equated with development, but also with exploitation. And then, of course, after a couple of decades of isolation, you then have China's opening. And when China starts to open, it did so step by step by step, which of course has been enormously frustrating to foreign companies and foreign governments. But we have to remember the context in which when China started to open to foreign investment, there was no regime in China to govern private sector companies of any type, right? Because there wasn't really much of a private sector in China. So the entire apparatus to administer, regulate, govern companies that were not controlled by the state had to be developed first in the context of dealing with foreign companies, and it was then extended to private sector companies. So what you see over time, again, evolution by geography, by sector, by mode of ownership, is China gradually opening at a rate where it was comfortable, it could maintain control, where it could develop the administrative capacity to deal with the investment. But then, at each stage, when it ran up against the wall in terms of what foreign companies were willing to place in China, the types of investment they were willing to make, then they opened further in order to get additional types, higher order and higher value foreign investment. So if you look at the entire regime since China's economic opening, it's an oversimplification, obviously, but not too much of an oversimplification to see it as a journey of mutual discovery, where the Chinese determining what they needed, what they wanted, and how to get it, without losing control, without losing some sense of sovereignty of the foreign companies. And for the foreign companies, their greater knowledge of what was going on in China, interacting with the risk profile of uncertain legal regimes and limited activities. And so even today, we see this again as a sort of path of mutual discovery. Because it only really works, the foreign investment in a country, if it's mutually beneficial. Obviously, if it's not beneficial to the country pushes back, and if it's not beneficial to the companies don't invest. Right? So this has been the ongoing process. And it's just been a different process from that we see in the US and other places. Another thing that's striking is that if we look at the Chinese literature, particularly the academic and the think tank literature, which is actually quite influential and feeds into policy in China, certainly most foreign companies have no clue that this literature even exists, and they certainly don't know what it says. And what's striking, particularly in the Chinese literature, is that the vast majority of this literature actually doesn't even address the question of is foreign direct investment good for China? Rather, it addresses the question, is foreign direct investment good for Chinese companies? And if you go back through the entire policy discussion on the Chinese side over the years, what becomes quite clear is that the objective function for foreign investment is that foreign investment is to be attracted in order to help build Chinese companies, Chinese capabilities, China's economy, in order that China can be strong economically and otherwise. The notion that foreign investment is supposed to increase competition or foreign investment is supposed to add to consumer welfare, that's hardly even mentioned. Okay? So we have to understand that there's this literature out there, and increasingly, as I said before, it's becoming sort of politically correct to minimize the impact of foreign investment. We see that in some of the literature. It's becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. People saying, well, it's sort of the political winds are blowing to minimize the importance of foreign investment. Therefore, that becomes the research conclusions, particularly in pieces that never get to the international arena for outside refereeing and comment. And then that feeds back into policy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So anyone dealing from the outside with the foreign investment regime in China has to understand that this is what's going on the input side. The facts and figures, run through it quickly. Again, in recent years, inbound investment into China has exceeded 120 billion US per year. Last year was 126 billion. It was about 77 billion in the first 7 months of this year, so we're on track for a similar level, which means that by the end of 2015, we had 1.8 trillion US dollars worth of foreign investment in China. That's just taking year on year current dollar amounts and adding them up, right? Just the simplest way of doing it, not taking into account depreciation or shifts in exchange rates, et cetera. And that looks like a whole lot of money. And it is a whole lot of money. But the discussion increasingly in China revolves around graphs like this. It's like, okay, we've got a lot of inward investment, 120 plus billion US dollars. But quite frankly, as a percentage of gross capital formation, it's around 3%. So to a first approximation, irrelevant and declining in importance. And then if you look at fixed asset investment, you see even less. So we're now at about 1.5%, irrelevant and declining. And even if we recognize that foreign invested enterprises have been almost dominant forces in China's trade, today foreign invested enterprises account for just under 50% of China's exports and just over 50% of China's imports. When we look at the GDP contribution of the net exports of foreign invested enterprises, as a percent of GDP, that peaked at about 4% in about 2008, and it's down under 2% today. So thank you very much, foreigners, but, irrelevant and declining in importance. And that's a lot of the discussion that you get when you talk to some academics and officials in China. But of course, there's a different story. Part of the different story emerges when you start going industry by industry. And you start looking, and my apologies for the small type, but you look at something like the computer industry in China, and 50% plus roughly is foreign invested enterprises. And if you look at the auto sector, again, it's roughly 50% is in the Sino-foreign joint ventures. And if you look at some of the more modern sectors of China's economy, you see foreign companies are making quite a strong contribution, whether you measure it in assets, revenues, profits, value add, et cetera. Okay? And in fact, if you go across the entire secondary sector, manufacturing, mining, utilities, by virtually any measure, foreign invested enterprises account for somewhat over 50% of whatever the sector does in China, be it assets, be it revenues, be it employment, be it value added. Okay? So that gives you a little bit of a different picture. But there's another way as well. And this other way I mentioned before is applying the tools of economic impact analysis. Right? And in essence, what these tools allow one to do is take the activities of a company or a particular investment and look at the impact not just of that investment, but of the operations that that investment fosters, and then the ripple effects back through the supply chains, and the impact of the consumer spending of the employees of the first set of companies and the second set of companies. So the direct impact is the investing company itself, its investment, its employment, its output, its value added, et cetera. The indirect is the impact of the supply chain, the ripple effects back through. And then the induced is the consumer spending of the employees of the direct and indirect industries. And then there are other impacts, which I'll call catalytic impacts, which is sort of everything else. And I've put those in dotted lines, the catalytic, because we don't directly estimate those for the Chinese economy. But for the direct, indirect, and induced, we actually can. We can do it with data that's available in China. The thing that's complicated is figuring out how to remove the potential double counting of a foreign invested enterprise sourcing from a foreign invested enterprise from a foreign invested enterprise. But that's possible to do, and in fact, we've done it in an extremely conservative manner in order to, again, err on the side of conservatism. And when we do that, we get a chart like this, or we get two charts like this. Now, the red here is the economic impact of the actual investment, an amount of capital coming in, the bricks and mortar, the support services that are involved in just getting the investment set up and running, and then the ripple effects through the supply chain and through the employment consumer spending impact. That's the red. The yellow is the economic impact that we estimate through the operations just in the secondary sector, mining, manufacturing, and utilities. Again, the direct plus indirect and induced. And the data for the service sector is not quite as good. But if we make the really quite extreme assumption that foreign invested enterprises in the service sector are on average no more productive than the Chinese firms, which again is an underestimate, we get that at least 10%, we get an additional roughly 10% of GDP in the foreign invested service companies and their supply chains. And since over the last 20 plus years, roughly half of all the foreign investment into China has been in the service sector, we know that that's an underestimate. And when we put those three together, what we get is the foreign invested enterprises, their investment, their operations, and their supply chains account for about a third of China's economy, about a third of GDP, 27% of employment. And as we can see, while the employment is going down, percentage is going down. Why? Because the foreign enterprises are becoming more efficient, more productive from a labor productivity standpoint. The GDP figures have actually been pretty stable for about the last 8 years. So even as the percent of foreign investment in total investment in China is going down, the impact of foreign companies together is not. And just think about the different discussion you start to have when you start having a discussion around this graph as opposed to this one, or this one, or this one, or in fact, even this one. So that's what we need to be thinking about. We need to be thinking about not just the companies themselves, not just their headlines, but that ripple effect throughout the economy as a whole. Now, that's, again, about a third of GDP. What does this not include? It does not include any quantitative estimate of the foreign invested enterprises working to modernize industries and companies in China. It doesn't include their investment in developing indigenous suppliers and distributors other than what directly winds up in their supply chain. It doesn't include their investing in foreign R&D and helping build up research institutes which have spillovers into the local economy. It doesn't include foreign companies bringing world-class business standards and practices to China that spills over into the local economy. It doesn't include the impact of foreign accounting firms and investment banks providing Chinese enterprises with access to billions and billions of dollars of capital from global capital markets. It doesn't include the role that foreign companies have played in improving environmental standards in China or in introducing CSR practices and CSR reporting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of these are above and beyond what we can quantify. And we've laid out in some amount of detail in the book, examples of some of these. Over 1,500 now foreign-funded R&D centers in China. What's that worth to China? When you see a company like Siemens training hundreds of engineers and only a reasonable fraction of them winding up ever working at Siemens. When you see modern business practices and business training being brought in by foreign enterprises and foreign companies. What value is that to China? We're actually just starting to think about how to place a value on that. And when we look at some of the individual company or corporate stories, we see more granularity. Hong Kong is the largest single foreign investor in China. But what's more important than the magnitude of investment was that Hong Kong companies helped build the initial infrastructure that made southern China economically viable. They've built the first reasonable mixed-use complexes, including world-class hotels and office space and retail and service departments, et cetera, that have allowed first-tier and then second-tier and now third-tier cities to become user-friendly to large international companies. They were pioneers in bringing in BOT-type infrastructure projects, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, if you want to put a value on proximity even to Hong Kong, the example that I use is comparing the two cities just north of Hong Kong, Shenzhen and Dongguan, to the two cities just north of Macau, Zhuhai and Zhongshan. In 1980, China just starts to open. A special economic zone is put in Shenzhen. A special economic zone is put in Zhuhai. That year, the combined GDPs of Zhongshan and Zhuhai were a good bit above the combined GDPs of Shenzhen and Dongguan. By 2013, that difference is in excess of $250 billion US dollars, and virtually all of that can be traced to international trade and international investment performance. Okay? So that's the value of being land contiguous linked to Hong Kong as opposed to being an hour and 20 minutes away by ferry. It turns out that the important players, the important company managers, the important investors, the important buyers, they don't take the ferry. They take the BMW or the Mercedes, which is why putting a bridge across from Hong Kong, Macau, and Zhuhai is going to start supercharging the other side of the Delta. That's just the Hong Kong story. I'll go through some of these others quickly. A company like P&G introduced entire product categories to China. Disposable diapers didn't exist in China until P&G developed it. In some parts of rural China, toothbrushing didn't exist until P&G invested to bring it. P&G found in China initially there weren't suitable suppliers, so it invented them. It built them. It financed them initially. And P&G worked with the Chinese government to develop over 10,000 distributors around China to enhance the retail and distribution sector in the country. And if we look at human resources these days, P&G is a net exporter of human resources from China. There are more Chinese citizens in senior management positions in P&G outside of China than there are foreign expats in senior management positions in P&G in China. And this is just one company. And in fact, when we do the economic impact analysis of P&G, we estimate that their entire system, including upstream, downstream, and all the consumer spending of employees, supports about $7 billion in GDP, $7 billion US dollars per year in GDP for China's economy, and about 600,000 employees. Other examples, and I'll go quickly, a company like Maersk, the shipping line, Just Maersk's increase in capacity on the shipping channels out of China over the last 10, 15 years, and what that's done in terms of cost reduction and increased access has an impact that's been estimated as high as $120 to $130 billion a year in additional trade for China. They helped develop the initial Chinese shipyards, which went from nowhere to world-leading producers in less than 2 decades, et cetera, et cetera. A company like Samsung basically was one of the first of the electronics companies to shift from made in China to created in China, and basically set up a second Samsung, complete with basic research, intermediate research, development design, all the advanced componentry, as well as simple assembly. They were one of the first to do that. They've worked with China to try to promote Chinese developed standards within China and internationally. They've been listed several times as the best foreign enterprise in China. But there's a cautionary tale as well. Samsung may be the single largest foreign direct investor in China. It's invested about $15 billion US dollars in China over about a 20-year period. But Samsung has also invested about $14 billion US dollars in Vietnam just over the last 10 years. And is certainly, as China's costs increase and as pressures on foreign companies rise in China, Samsung has a plan B, and it will have a plan C, and other companies eventually will as well. Selected cities, again, we went city by city. I'll just give you some of the highlights. Shanghai, just the direct activities of foreign invested enterprises are 2/3 of trade and gross industrial output, 1/3 of tax and employment. That's just the direct. That doesn't include their supply chains. It doesn't include the consumer spending. My favorite fun fact, though, about Shanghai is that, and if we think about China and China emerging as a technology power and the role that foreign companies play in that, was that in 2004, according to the Shanghai official statistics, foreign invested enterprises accounted for about 83% of output in high technology industries in China. What do you think the number was in 2014? Higher, lower, right? After 10 years of the drive for indigenous innovation, the number was 90%. So to a first approximation, without the foreign invested enterprises, Shanghai doesn't have a tech sector. And if Shanghai doesn't have a tech sector without foreign invested enterprises, I can tell you nowhere in China has a tech sector without the foreign invested enterprises. Right? Shenzhen is similar. Shenzhen basically didn't exist in its present form until foreign investment came into play. Tianjin, basically, again, all the leading industries in Tianjin have developed around foreign direct investment. And in Chongqing, another example in the tech sector, as late as 2007, 2008, Chongqing produced 0 personal computers. And this year, Chongqing will produce over 1/3 of the world's personal computers. And that's all due to the investment of foreign companies. And what's also interesting, in each of these cities, the leading initiatives to move the cities to the next level of development all not only involve more foreign investment, they require more foreign investment if they're going to work. Okay? So this is what's going on at the local level. So what are some of the questions that we get asked from time to time? One is, does China need the money associated with inward investment? Well, I mean, it's only 1%, 2%. So to a first approximation, do they need the capital? The answer is no. But that's not the important thing that the foreign investment has brought. The foreign investment has brought the linkages to global markets, international standards, world-class technology, management practices, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Can Chinese companies and indigenous investment play these same roles? Well, these days, the playing field is fairly heavily tilted towards the Chinese companies. So if they could do it, they would be doing it today. And the fact that they're not doing it, and in so many sectors the gap is still quite large, shows us that Chinese companies are not ready at this point to take on those roles. Don't foreign companies just displace Chinese companies? We actually find the opposite, that foreign investment actually results in additional domestic investment, not reduced domestic investment. And in fact, in some cases, it allows China to redeploy its capital into areas that are a bit needier, that require more of an injection of government capital. Has the value of Chinese partners and joint ventures been understated? The value of that is quite high. We're certainly aware of that. But to the extent that those joint venture partners have yet themselves been able to compete internationally, it sort of shows us where the world-class expertise is. And has, maybe China's benefited from foreign investment in the past, but does it need it in the future? And the idea there is, well, even if China were to somehow catch up with the current generation of technology, products, services, what about the next generation? And the generation after that? And the generation after that? Whenever Chinese handset companies and mobile phones have increased their share significantly against the foreign companies, what the foreign companies have done is they've reduced their cycle times, introduced new generations quicker, and then they've reestablished their position pretty quickly. What are some of the implications? For China, the first implication is well done. Again, however much we outsiders might complain about the process, China has managed a foreign investment process where it's been able to retain control, retain sovereignty, and get enormous benefits from foreign investment. Could they have been larger? Answer, yes. But they've been quite large, right? But again, well done, but don't really, not necessarily a good idea to change the game now. Because again, what about the next generation, the next generation, the next generation? What about other countries? Well, one implication is that actually the tools and techniques that we've developed to try to evaluate foreign investment in China, we can use almost anywhere. Where some basic data requirements are met, we can do this for virtually any country. We can put those tools in the hands of others. Another thing, of course, that other countries should learn is, again, that there's a way to generate value from foreign investment without incurring many of the downsides that countries fear when they talk about foreign investment. What about multinational companies, source countries, and business groupings? Well, here I think the main story is that many of these organizations are simply not armed with all the data, with all the information, with all the firepower that they could use to make their case for the value that they create locally. Most of the companies we see say, we invested this amount, we employ this many people. In some cases, the entire range of activities that result from those operations can be, in employment terms, 20 times their direct employment. And the value added can be 3-4 times what they generate directly. So again, when we think about approaching trade negotiations, or investment negotiations, and we talk about or approach the issues of why should we have or why shouldn't we have foreign investment, and what types of value that can be generated, again, we think that the debate can be significantly enhanced by having some greater analytical firepower brought to bear, some additional tools that will allow us to progress in the future. And with that, I thank you.
Let me invite Aaron and Scott to Yeah, we're live again. You can just put the microphone in the corner here so nobody trips. We're not. There, perfect.
There you go.
Excellent. All right, we're in business again. Thanks again to all of you who are here, and Michael, thank you for the detailed presentation. I had a chance to review this book before publication, and I'm impressed with the depth of the analysis, and I think it'll be a valuable tool. I'm joined now, not just by Michael, but by my colleague Scott Kennedy, who is the Deputy Director of the Freeman Chair in China Studies and is the expert about the Chinese economy here at CSIS, and by Aaron Ennis, who is the Senior Vice President at the U.S.-China Business Council, the business organization that represents American companies in China. When we set up this event, the foundation was happy to provide us with pre-publication manuscripts, and as a result, Scott and Aaron have had a chance to read the book. And I've asked them to make brief comments, and then we'll allow Michael a chance to comment on their comments, or we'll discuss it among a panel, and then we'll open it for questions to the audience. So, Aaron, would you like to start?
Thank you for having me. It was a very deep read, I will say that. And for those of us who kind of spend our days doing deep dives into data, it was very helpful to kind of see it all laid out. I thought what I would do for kind of the points I thought were the most important was focus on three areas of ones that we certainly were in agreement with the findings that you have, but ones that I think have those policy implications that you noted were not covered in it. The first one was just kind of a general point. The analysis in Michael's book shows that it showed on the various aspects of investment in terms of the spending by Chinese employees and the actual investment itself, in terms of almost a third of China's economy being thanks to foreign direct investment and almost a third of employment being based on it. Those are numbers that I think are important and ones that we shouldn't lose sight of. I think that Michael is right. There is, I think, a tendency to assume that somehow foreign direct investment in China has run its course. That is a conversation in China that probably is not the conversation that goes on in Washington, where the assumption might be just the opposite. But I think that the interesting aspect from my point of view is that we really see that very significantly in manufacturing. I think that makes sense because it's the sector that was probably opened the widest when China joined the World Trade Organization. And it is the one that has become the global leader as the most competitive industry probably in the world. While the United States still outpaces China in terms of output, in terms of efficiency, in terms of actual product that is put into the market from the manufacturing side, China is coming up very rapidly on that front. And that is thanks to the competition that those companies have faced due to foreign investment in the marketplace, making them fight for every dollar and for every sale that they get. I think the interesting thing that is missing in China's economy, and to a certain extent I would assume also therefore in the data, is that we have yet to see a similar benefit in China's services sector. While employment is quite large generally in services in China, there are some questions that can be raised about exactly how many insurance salesmen a company like Ping An really needs when the market really isn't very well developed. The kinds of efficiency that competition brings, not just from foreign companies investing in a market, but then the competition that happens amongst Chinese companies, I think is something that once China feels more comfortable in opening up and hopefully does that sooner rather than later for the rest of our sakes, I think the services sector there can become probably as competitive as China's manufacturing sector is. The second points that I thought were particularly interesting and that Michael didn't touch on as much in his presentation, but there was a significant amount of analysis about the benefits of corporate social responsibility in China. And these are areas where when you talk to American companies about what they're doing in China, the conversation about CSR activities tend to go hand in glove with them. It's not just because they're trying to be good corporate citizens. I think that the kinds of best practices that foreign companies bring into the market are ones that are the standard. They are among the reasons why companies that are investing overseas are among the largest and most profitable. It is part of their business model to bring those standards to the countries that they operate in. But I think it's also important to recognize that companies do things like CSR activities and ensure that they have safe food products that they're selling in a market, not just because they have very warm hearts and they feel that the rest of the world should benefit from it. It's because they also recognize that there is a downside to your company's reputation and therefore a risk to your sales if you don't do those kinds of things. The United States, I think, frequently has focused, or the discussion, I should say, in the United States has frequently viewed international trade as somehow a race to the bottom, and that is absolutely not the case. China, I think, is case in point of that. I suspect most of the people in this room probably have spent time in China. You know the difference of what China looks like today versus what it looked like in the 80s or 90s when many of us first started going. That is thanks to significant new investment and what it's driven, and by international companies bringing those standards into the market. The last point that I wanted to touch on is the last chapter in Michael's book, which talks about the future of foreign investment in China. And this is, I would say, a particularly challenging discussion to have. While I think the data that Michael lays out is very good in terms of making the case of why foreign direct investment should continue to be welcomed and encouraged in China, it is very clear that there is a significant internal debate going on in China about economic reforms and about how much to either remain open or to further open to foreign investment in the market. We see that on a day-to-day basis with our member companies that invest in China. Our most recent survey data from June of this year noted that companies are somewhat optimistic about their prospects in China over the next 5 years. But we have seen a shift over the last 10 years of a shift in that optimism from companies flat out saying they were optimistic about their prospects to companies becoming somewhat optimistic. It's been a shift of about 25 points. So we're not talking about a small change. We're talking about a significant change in what companies perceive their opportunities are going to be in the market. They also tell us exactly what their concerns are, and they are among the things that hopefully data like in Michael's book can help to try to address in China, at least partly, which is the policy and regulatory environment towards foreign companies. Immediately followed after that is the effects of the fact that China's economy is slowing down and what that means in terms of how you operate in business. But about 2/3 of companies identified the policy and regulatory environment. When you compare how companies view China to other emerging markets, on that global prospect side, China still is outpacing just about everybody. It's still viewed as a significant new opportunity. But on that regulatory side, the view is very mixed for foreign companies. It's about 1/3 each between companies that view the regulatory environment in China as being better, the same, or worse, which I think at best we could characterize as a mixed bag on what the outcomes are. That uncertainty about the direction of reforms, the openness to foreign investment, those mixed signals are really ones that China, we hope, will pay attention to and seek to address. China has stated its own plans for economic reforms over the past 2 to 3 years, I guess, at this point, and has repeatedly stated that they will remain open to foreign investment and that any liberalizations they have will provide equal opportunities to domestic and foreign companies. But we really have seen very limited implementation of that. That creates that challenge. If China is to maintain the growth levels that it wants, if it wants to move into having a globally competitive services sector, remaining open to foreign investment and opening further to foreign investment is going to be vital to it. It's among the reasons why the U.S.-China Business Council has viewed the negotiations of a bilateral investment treaty as essential, because it could lock in some of those openings and hopefully accelerate them at a pace with also enforcement of it if they were to fail to do that. But I would say my last point would be on that clearer movement of being not only explicit in stating an openness to foreign investment and the interest in moving forward with it, but also implementing it. Senior leadership in China, I would say, should take note of that, take note of the benefits of the points that Michael makes in his book. But until we start seeing implementation of those policies, I think the narrative, at least in the United States business community about these, is probably going to remain mixed. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Erin. Scott?
It's a hard act to follow. Both, I want to, both of them. I really, really like this book. I thought it was absolutely fascinating, and I learned a ton from the first page to the last page. So they're right out around the corner. I hope you line up. I'm not being paid to say that. You need to look at this book. There's a lot of new stuff in there. And it, I think, tells an important story, but I don't know if it tells necessarily the story that is the truth that we just want to hear, right? I think it tells some truths that are uncomfortable to hear because a conversation about the benefits in China are different than a conversation about the benefits in the United States. But I think it goes more than that because it's such a good study, and it prompts, I think, really important critical thinking. I don't need to discuss how it's been helpful. Michael's charts and the description explain that in detail, the direct, the indirect, and I love the term catalytic. I think that's exactly right, not just the residual or the extra or anything like that. How much it's prompted progress in China's economy and society broadly. But I think one of the big questions that I think the book touches upon is why is this effect so positive? Why has foreign investment done so much? And it discusses two kinds of answers, but it focuses on mostly just one of those. It talks primarily about the foreign side factors that contribute to making this foreign investment beneficial, about the technology, the management skills, the know-how, global best practices, the diffusion, the bringing these things to China, the commitment that foreign companies have shown. And I think that's all true. At the same time, I think the China side factors are a critical and inseparable part of the story. And you do mention those things. The political stability, smart people, the willingness to open up, right, at all, to allow foreign investment. But I think it's also important that these China side factors, I think they don't add up to a story which is globalization is a good thing and throwing your doors open is a good thing and that generates the returns. I think actually the story is, what did China do? China has put an amazing amount of pressure on multinational companies to do these things, to share technology, to share best practices, to be in joint ventures, when many of them didn't want to. They did these things so much, they left sleepless nights for our friends from USTR and others in the global business community who found these things entirely unfair and onerous. But it may in fact be those things that we really didn't want to do that in fact are critical to the explanation of how China was able to effectively utilize foreign investment to its advantage. The conditionality of access to the market, the requirements for sharing technology, the openness of different sectors at different stages. China originally opened investment into hotels and basic services, and then manufacturing, then advanced manufacturing, and now high tech. Each year they have a foreign investment catalog that says what are the priority sectors, what are the non-priority sectors, what are those that are totally off limits. And it could be that it isn't the areas of openness, but it's the way they opened. That screen on the door is as important as the opening of the door itself. And I think that is an uncomfortable truth that comes from the book, because it means that the argument to China isn't, and to the rest of the world isn't, just open up your doors and accept foreign investment because it will help you. It is, do it the way the Chinese have done it. Be careful, play your cards close to your vest, make a lot of demands, and then those benefits will diffuse to you. I think that might be one conclusion. Of course, you're also extremely careful in pointing out that China is an outlier, that it is distinctive in its ability to do those things. If China were a smaller country with a smaller market, there wouldn't be that potential desire for companies to go to China and to put up with so much, right? So so the China story is definitely not replicable every place. There has to be this possibility of future market potential, and that shadow of the future for China gives it amazing leverage, I think. And it's why companies and industry associations and others are willing to put up with what is very difficult day-to-day operations. And so it's interesting that in East Asia, China's story of foreign investment playing such a critical role in their development and growth is different than almost all of its neighbors. So Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, much less open to foreign investment, much less critical to their success stories. I think something about their size also may play an effect on this. So anyway, I think to me, the China side story of how it's helpful is part of the equation. I guess the second point I want to make is a question that's not entirely addressed in the book, but because you can only write a book that's so long. But as someone who was an academic, still kind of recovering, trying to get over it, there's a question that jumped out to me, which is about does all foreign investment that goes in China have the same positive effect? Now you focus, you have macro data on everything, but your case studies focus on P&G, for Scott's sake, Maersk, and Samsung. That's all a total just a joke. I'm sorry. Sorry.
Michael and I never met before.
Yes,
so.
yes, yeah. So, honestly, really, just a joke. I can't help myself. I'm just like that other guy on TV last night. So, without the problems. And I like to drink a lot of water.
Do I need to watch out?
Yeah. So what about investment from other advanced economies? If you broke it down by the origin of the investment, does the value added, the benefits of Chinese society, have they come more from American companies than, say, from your typical Japanese company, your typical British company, South Korean? If there is a difference, and Americans are that provide more, we want to know, because we want to be able to tell China our investment helps you more than everybody else. If the Americans don't help as much, don't report that at all, because we don't want anyone to know. But it would be curious to know if there's some type of variation. One other question. It's two points. One question and then one point. I know that you focus primarily on the benefit for Chinese society and the economy as a whole, and the diffusion to industry as a whole. But are there certain types of companies in China that have benefited better from this collaborations, from this investment than others? And I'm mainly thinking of the difference between Chinese private companies and state-owned companies. State-owned companies often have been prioritized in foreign investment because the Chinese government wants them to be helped more, but they tend to be wasteful of their capital. Really hugely wasteful. China's total factor productivity has dropped recently, its contribution to growth, and that's all because of state-owned enterprises. But I'm wondering, does the collaboration with foreign companies actually give them a bigger boost than to private companies who may already, quote unquote, get it? So then I guess the last question, and this is a policy point since we're in Washington, is what do we do with this information? Obviously we need to tell the Chinese how that multinationals have contributed a third to their GDP, and not the minor 3 to 4% that they think, and that they better listen. But if they don't listen, if they don't adapt, if they don't take Aaron's excellent advice and the others that many are giving, and that is occurring through the negotiations, should there be any consequences We know from surveys by the American Chamber of Commerce in China that the proportion of American companies either planning to leave or have already left, moved some of their investment, has started to grow. In 2014, it was 13% of the surveyed companies. Last year, it was 25%, and I'm told, since the survey is just about done and the interviews have already occurred with a lot of these companies, that this year's number is going to be higher than that. So if companies vote with their feet, might that have an effect on China's investment climate? And maybe they have a lot of leverage that they didn't realize that they have because of how much they contribute. On the flip side, given how much foreign investment is meant to China's economy, should Americans have the same expectation about Chinese investment in the American economy? Should we expect it to provide that much benefit to us? And that investment there now, not just a parity. Chinese investment here is way higher than American investment in China. So should we also hold out hope that that type of investment will provide not only jobs, but other types of benefits to the American society that we can use to explain to Americans why we ought to continue to encourage open trade and investment rather than take some of the bait that was offered last night and that we hear in the political conversation that globalization is a bad thing, when we know that the math that you've worked so hard on shows that by and large, this ought to be win-win. There's areas that can be improved and tweaked, but by and large, we ought to continue to encourage this process, not get in its way. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. And let me channel Lester Holt for a second here and ask Michael if he wants to respond.
Sure. First, thank you both. First off, for the detailed reading that you both did, and for your comments and questions. Maybe I'll start with Aaron's comments. And yes, the most obvious benefits to China's economy from foreign investment have been in the manufacturing sector, and China itself is struggling with developing the service sector. I've actually had at least half a dozen major Chinese cities send delegations to me in Hong Kong asking, how do you develop the service sector? And one of the reasons why they're having difficulty coming to grips with it is it's not like developing, the manufacturing sector like it was in the old days, when you could put, an industrial park in place, you had a foreign market already in place, products were specified by foreign companies provided the technology, China provided the land and the low-cost labor, and, pour on some water and out came, manufacturing and low-wage manufacturing exports. And interestingly enough, when Chinese cities first try to develop the service sector, they gravitate towards the service sectors that are most like that. Things like business process outsourcing, low-level IT outsourcing, where basically what you do is you create a little industrial park and you hire people who are capable but at lower wages than international, and they try to ramp up that way. What they don't quite get as of yet is the notion that the service sector is derived demand, and it's derived demand from a local business community and consumer community that sees the value created. And so when I'm asked what to do to develop the service sector, be it in Wuhan or Chongqing or Chengdu or Dalian or Qingdao, my first answer is go after the big, highly capable service companies, the global ones, with exactly the same vigor that you went after the big manufacturing companies. Because it's bringing in the big four accounting companies, the big banks, the international consulting companies, the international architects and engineering firms. This is what, first off, is going to raise the quality of your service sector, and secondly, is going to provide the training ground for all of those professions in China. Because a lot of those sectors have been more sensitive in the past, perhaps in China, they've been slow to do so and slow to see that you don't just, invest in the industrial park and out pops the service sector. But you're exactly right. They claim that services is the next horizon. Productivity growth in the service sector in China has been way lower than in the manufacturing. Part of that is to be expected by the nature of some services. But it's also because the cutting edge, internationally capable service companies are less prominent on the ground than is international investment in manufacturing. So that's point well taken. If we think about this sort of why it is that foreign companies are questioning their position in China, it does come down to a few different things. It does come down to the environment being more difficult. While I believe that this is primarily due to basically industrial policy considerations, there is a glass half full interpretation. The glass half full interpretation is that in shifting from a sort of control to a regulatory and legal and administrative form of governance, the natural tendency would be to overshoot in the early days. And maybe what we'll see is as they get comfortable with the legal tools, the administrative, the regulatory tools, that maybe there'll be a bit of a ratcheting back. I don't know. I think that's far more likely should they start to fear that if they don't, they'll lose important investment. With respect to, a third see things going well, a third not well, and a third sort of in the middle, those are roughly the percentages that we see in our work. But to us, what's critically important is that those are not random. That basically there are some industries where the Chinese leaders know that they're important to China's future. They contribute to high-order objectives of the Chinese government and the party. And they know that indigenous companies are not quite there yet. So a lot of areas of environmental technology today, in our view, companies have energy-efficient technologies. In some areas, environmental specific activities. We're seeing doors being opened to them. We're also seeing a group of companies that are in sectors that are sort of beneath the radar screen. The Chinese leadership, to my assessment, doesn't really care who's selling toothbrushes and toothpaste, right? So consumer packaged goods companies, they continue to be good citizens, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, they're seeing tougher local competitors, but they're not being targeted in our view. It's the companies that are in industries where the industries or the relevant technologies are viewed as strategic and where the belief is that Chinese companies are close enough that government intervention will tip the scales. That's where we see, the companies sort of in the crosshairs. And of course, neither of us are even discussing the companies and industries that are where they're prohibited from investing in China, which is a whole nother area. To shift over, and sorry, I'm jumping, but to shift over to some of Scott's points. If we look again at the China side factors, yes, basically guilty as charged. We sort of do indicate that these are important along the way. We do describe the policy evolution, but we don't describe, the massive investment that China's made in literacy and in the education sector in general. We don't go through the massive investments that China's made in infrastructure, et cetera, right? When I fly from China to the U.S., I have to remind myself which end has the developing country. So yes, those are understated, perhaps, or we don't go through them in detail in the book. Again, it's not necessarily our focus, but point well taken. If we think about some of the other questions or points you ask, the types of companies that benefit, We didn't separate them through, but we actually describe in some of the literature. In the literature that's out there, almost across the board, if you look, of course, historically, initially, the big investments came in from Hong Kong, Taiwan. And so whatever positive impact there was for the first 6, 7 years of inward investment, that came almost exclusively from companies investing from other parts of Asia in terms of infrastructure services, light manufacturing, et cetera. Subsequent to that period, not surprisingly, it's the OECD, it's investors from the OECD economies that are seen to contribute most to management practice, most to technology advancement, most on environmental standards, most on CSR standards, et cetera. We don't have the data to separate out U.S. companies from that. We also don't have the data as of yet to separate specifically the U.S. company impact on China. Because the Chinese official statistics, of course, have a lot of the investment coming from Hong Kong, and we know some of it is rooted through Hong Kong. And perhaps that's something we should talk about, is to see if we can get sort of a complete set of information. If we can get, what the U.S. companies are investing and their revenues by sector, we can do the analysis just for U.S. companies. What can we do with the information? Yes, tell China. Good job. Keep it going. In terms of, is being as restrictive as China has been, is that the right answer? There we run into the counterfactual, right? If they had opened faster, would they have even more? If they opened more completely today, it's actually quite clear that they would get more. But again, it's not necessarily the view in China. If one reads, for example, the Chinese literature on the impact of foreign investment on the banking sector, foreign banks are 2-3% of banking assets in China, so it's minuscule. But all the literature claims that even that presence has dramatically improved risk management, managerial capabilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, in the Chinese banking sector. Now I see Peter Bottelier here, who knows a lot about the Chinese banking sector, maybe smiling a bit. Again, what hasn't been asked or answered is, would a whole lot more foreign presence have done that much more? And while I can say my belief is yes, I don't have the data to do it. Private sector companies that are competing against foreign invested enterprises progress much more rapidly than state companies competing against foreign enterprises. And when they partner, the SOEs jump considerably. But in many of the sectors, it's hard to get a clean dichotomy between the two. But in general, the private sector seems to have benefited more from the competitive impacts, from the ability to hire relatively few state enterprises, hire from the foreign companies. The private sector companies do it all the time. So surprisingly, at least our information would indicate that the private sector companies benefit a bit more. In terms of the impact of China's investment on the U.S., this is a study yet to be done. Because when the Chinese quote their benefits to the U.S., they do it in terms of, we've invested this much and we employ directly this number of people. And they certainly haven't, and no one else to our knowledge has done the sort of analysis that we're talking about. So, they can benefit from this as much as we can. I know I haven't answered everything, but in the interest, again, anything I've missed that's important, just come back at me otherwise.
That's terrific. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Aaron and Scott, for the questions. Let me turn now to the audience, and we'll try to respond to your questions. Ask you to follow 3 simple rules. First, if you're called on for a question, wait for the microphone. We are broadcasting this, webcasting this, and the online audience won't hear you if you speak before the microphone. Second, start by telling us who you are and what organization you are representing. Then please try to ask a question and not make a statement. But we don't enforce the last of those rules too diligently. But in any case, any questions that we could respond to? Yes, sir, over here.
Hello, my name is Benjamin Lee, and I'm from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So my question has to do with trying to bridge the gap between two different realities. One reality is that FDI, as you mentioned in your book, has made enormous contributions to the Chinese economy. But at the same time, China is increasingly considering, or its skepticism toward FDI is increasing. How can I make sense of these two different divergences? And are there any downsides to FDIs in China? Thank you.
When I deal with China, no matter what aspect, I look at it as a Rubik's Cube. You know, it all looks jumbled up, but eventually if you keep twisting and turning and twisting and turning and twisting and turning, when you get all the sides to line up, you know, that's probably when you get close to the right answer. The reason for the seeming contradiction is that we don't understand what their objective function is. The objective function, number one, is control. Number two is developing the indigenous companies and economy. And number three, adding to the wealth and welfare of Chinese people. When you understand it in that context, with control being first, developing Chinese companies second, then you start to understand a bit better why, in terms of its foreign investment rules and regulations, that China may be doing things that seem to us or to me as a Westerner silly on the surface. This is also one of the reasons, to link back to a question that I didn't answer, is, you know, the notion of reciprocity in an investment negotiation or an investment treaty. You know, it makes sense, right? Well, what's fair is fair. And certainly to corporate America, you know, they want reciprocity. However, what's our, you know, in the US, what's our objective function? Our objective function is different. Our objective function tends to be develop the economy first, consumer welfare either first or second, and support for indigenous companies third or fourth. And as long as we have a different objective function, we will run into these contradictions and into these conflicts. And the question that I would pose, and I do pose to people who ask about reciprocity, I say, what's the objective function? If the U.S. is going to change its objective function, well, that's a discussion that can be had and debated. But until the U.S. changes its objective function, or China changes its objective function, now implicitly what we've been trying to do is get them to change their objective function, right? And therein lies the apparent contradiction and certainly the conflict. And as long as we have a system in the United States that is built around one set of premises, I think we need to really think long and hard if we're going to give up those premises and give up that priority simply because something appears not to be fair.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Peter Botelier. I am no longer representing anybody, but I used to teach at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and before that I ran the World Bank program in China in the 90s. That's where I met Michael, a long time ago. Extremely interesting presentation, full of factual and not so factual information. It's on that second part I wanted to ask you. One of the most striking numbers is this 1/3 contribution to GDP. Now, that depends almost entirely on your estimate of the indirect contributions. That's the yellow part in the chart you showed. How confident are you about your methodology in estimating the indirect effects? Let me explain, because if you were to apply the same methodology to the local Chinese enterprises, who presumably also have direct and indirect contributions, is it possible that the total contributions of domestic and foreign enterprises come to over 100% of GDP? So it's a methodological question.
The answer to the second part is if you remove the double counting, no. It actually doesn't. Now, yes, there are Chinese companies in the supply chains that are picked up as being part of the contribution of the foreign companies and their supply chains. But the only portion of their activities that go into the impact of the foreign companies are those where their end sales are completely dependent on the foreign companies. Remove the foreign companies, those sales go away, right? So on that point, we're actually quite confident. Now, if all the foreign companies left, would a third of China's economy go away today? Well, the answer is you would get backfill, right? You would get backfill because eventually somebody will, be selling toothbrushes and toothpaste. But the point is they would be doing so at significantly less efficiency than you have today. So there would be a decline, it wouldn't be a third. And we don't claim that if you removed it all, a third of the economy would go away. We claim that with the operations, the ripple effects, et cetera, it's about a third of the economy. Why am I confident that those numbers are at worst accurate or at best accurate? No. Well, you tell me. I think they're a huge underestimate, actually. And here's the reason why. Remember when I put up the secondary sector and by industry? If you look at the bottom, everything is 20%. Now, the secondary sector in China, manufacturing, mining, utilities, is 50% of the economy. So just the direct activities of foreign invested enterprises in the secondary sector, if it's all roughly 20% or a little more than 20% of that secondary sector, that's 10% of GDP right there. So that's a base which is about as hard a base as possible because it's only the direct activities of the foreign invested enterprises in half of the economy. So then when you look at the indirect and induced effects of that, that gives you another 6-7%. Then if you look at the impact of the physical capital, the bricks and mortar, the support services, just to get factories built and up and running, that's about 2-3%. So now we're up around 20%. Half of foreign investment in China since 1995 has gone into the service sector. All we're estimating, and the service sector is 45% roughly of China's GDP these days. We're saying that roughly an equal amount of investment in the service sector that's generating 20% of GDP, including all the ripple effects in the manufacturing, even if we say it's half of that, it's only 10%. Our view is it's probably more because, again, on the ground, service industries source from other service industries. The employment effect, the ripple effect of the supply chain is mostly local, whereas in the manufacturing you can have imported inputs, which we take into account. So we think our estimate in the service sector is quite low. And at 10%, even though, again, it's been roughly half of the foreign investment in. So we take 10, 10, 10, we get 30, and we think each of those is probably an underestimate. And then on top of that, as I said before, this doesn't take into account any contribution of technology spillovers, of educational spillovers, of management systems, of, we've had some discussion with the big four accounting firms. What's the value of the Chinese companies, purely indigenous companies, that have sourced, capital in international capital markets? What's the value to them and to Chinese economy of being, linked to global capital markets by the foreign firms? So our view is that the things that we believe we can safely estimate and conservatively estimate is about a third, and that all these other effects are somewhat more. But even if it's not 33%, if it's 30% or 29%, it's a whole lot more than 1.5%, which is our main point.
We have time for one more question? Yes, sir. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Thomas Yandel. I work in and with Vietnam, and I've written a marginally similar book on Vietnam. And so my question, if I can ask two short ones connected, are comparative. So the first one is Vietnam and China both have a an uneven development system. So they intentionally, or unbalanced, they intentionally develop certain areas and then hope that the overflow would develop the rest. And in Vietnam, you have a very active transfer system where the rich provinces really are taxed, or that they transfer money in order to pay for the poor provinces' development. Is that similar in China, or is China really developing that hinterland? There's a book, Developing a Hinterland, right? And the second question is, very short, I think in Vietnam you can really very nicely see the impact of state-owned enterprises versus of FDI enterprises versus domestic enterprises when you look at ICOR, incremental capital output ratio. Do you have a comparison for that for China? Thank you.
On the second question, there is information that breaks down performance across China's economy by type of ownership. And basically, the foreign invested enterprises on average do better. The SOE sector has been, in a sense, distorted by two things. It gets distorted by, monopolies and oligopolies in some sectors on the one hand, but it also gets a bit distorted by the fact that the SOEs have been, in large part, the agents of China's global financial crisis response, where basically what they've done is they've pushed the SOEs to invest as a means of trying to keep the economy stimulated. And I think that has something to do with some of the facts that Scott reported about their efficiency going down. But you always have to be a little bit careful because, for example, in terms of profitability, always the companies that report the lowest profitability in China are the Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwanese-owned companies, basically because they all transfer their profits into Hong Kong. So where one locates the value added becomes a real question. But in general, the way it works out is the foreign companies are the most productive. The private enterprises in China are the second most productive. And then depending on how you attribute the profits of the Hong Kong companies mostly compared to SOEs, they're sort of down in the pecking order. That was one half. That was the second half of your question. The first half was?
Interprovincially.
What the government's done in China, it's both promoted foreign investment into priority areas. So as of the year 2000, it was the Go West policy. And it took about 15 years, actually, for that to start bearing fruit, because they said go west, and the company said, why bother? And in some industries where the approvals are more directly controlled, they simply made it happen. Ford wanted to build its first plant in Nanjing. They were told, you will go to Chongqing and you will like it, or you will not be in China. Liberty Mutual, the insurance company, was able to jump over 100 other insurance companies that were in the queue for a license because they were willing to go to Chongqing during that period. So they've tried to influence that, but largely the investment has gone into the places where the economics would dictate it. But what's interesting is that the backfill in part has been foreign investment freeing up capital, Chinese capital, that could be deployed in the interior. And one of the things that we've done in the course of this project, it's just maybe a line in the book because we haven't gone through our econometric results in great detail. I think we're the first to look at this. We actually looked at whether foreign investment in the coastal provinces in China stimulated domestic investment in the interior in China. And the answer is an unambiguous yes. So China has tried through additional favorable policies to direct investment. That's gradually been to the priority areas. The companies that have had to go along have. The ones that haven't had to go along largely haven't. But even the process of investing into the coastal economies appears to have freed up Chinese capital, particularly capital that could be directed by the government into other parts of China. But clearly, one of the problems that non-coastal or the more disadvantaged areas of China have is their inability to attract foreign investment, and the asymmetric geographic distribution of foreign investment has contributed to disparities in China, more because the backward areas can't attract the investment rather than anything else.
Well, let me thank you for your time and attention this afternoon, and also invite you to all my future events, because you ask a better grade of question than my typical audience. So thanks for that. And then, before you go, let me also invite you to a reception that we're hosting out in the lobby. I'm a corporate guy by training, so there are only 3 reasons to do anything. The 3 reasons to stay for the reception are: first, there are a better grade of snacks and better grade of refreshments than what we offered beforehand, so you'll have to see for yourself on that. Second, you'll have a chance to interact with Michael and the other panelists in case you didn't get your question answered in the room. And third, if you do buy Michael's book, you'll have a chance to increase its value immediately by having him autograph it. So in any case, thank you again. Please join me in thanking the panelists, and we'll see you outside.